Welcome to the 2023 Wally Redekop Lecture on Peace and Development. This lecture was set up as an endowed lecture fund to honor Wally, who had a distinguished career with CETA doing international agricultural development work for over 40 years. He started his career in Arusha, Tanzania, and worked on agricultural projects around the world. The last part of his career was spent doing agricultural development work in China up until 2006 when he retired. During that time, he evolved his programming from working on individual projects to doing system-wide agricultural development. He was so effective in China that at one point my father was at a reception with a minister from China, and this government minister said to my dad, because of your brother, millions of people have food to eat. What was at the heart of Wally's work in China was bringing diverse voices together around a complex issue, which had to do with food for pigs, actually, but it involved issues around health, issues around agriculture, issues around food distribution, and there were so many stakeholders that he was able to bring them all together and find a creative way to move ahead, which made systemic changes to food production in China. And his methodology then was replicated in a number of other programs within China. As a result, he got a distinguished medal from the President Xi of China, one of a very small number of international development people that was recognized in that way. Upon his death, his wife Chris and my dad, Bill Redekop, set up this endowed lectureship. What characterized Wally's style were three things. He was highly convivial, so anytime he went to see any of his projects, there would be an immediate gathering of people in a bar and lots of stories and lots of interaction together. And it was that capacity to bring people together and develop relationships that enabled him to be so effective. He was also very pragmatic. He knew how to get things done that would produce results, and he knew the difference between getting things done in a linear manner, as in, remember one time he was talking about a project to vaccinate cattle, and he said, we just have to get those needles into the cattle as quickly as possible. No delays, it just has to be done quickly. But he was also able to work on the people side of development, and getting things done meant establishing relationships and getting people who were competent. So he had a great gift in finding competent people that he had met along the way, his former professors at the University of Saskatchewan, other professors across Canada. He'd find a niche for them to make a very significant development. And so he was very practical, convivial, and he was very creative in how he went about things. And he was able to ask questions that would get right to the heart of what was going on in any of these projects. So as we think about honoring Wally, we want people who can do similar things. And this year's lecture is being presented by Naresh Singh, who also had a distinguished career in CETA. One of the things that he worked on is issues of poverty, not only at CETA, but at the United Nations with leading figures within the field. But he started his poverty work with a group in Winnipeg, which you're going to hear more about. But he talked to people in poverty, and he asked them how they were getting by and how they survived. And he realized that people who are poor have assets, and they're able to keep living because they use these assets. So instead of saying, we have to do something for people, he took the approach that, why don't we start with the assets that people have and see if we can build on those? So he distinguished himself within the field of development as one of the pioneers in bringing complexity theory to bear on complex issues in the development world. And this is what he's going to talk to you about as he brings his thinking around creativity, emergent creativity, applied spirituality, and human development to issues around the Anthropocene, to find ways in which we can creatively live and thrive in this era of very rapid change within our world.
It's an honor and special privilege for me to be doing the Wally Redekop Lecture on Peace and Development 2023. I am Naresh Singh, and I am entitling this talk, Coming to Our Senses, Complexity, Spirituality, and Thrivability in the Anthropocene. And you will soon come to recognize the reason for the selection of that topic. I should acknowledge that the reason I'm giving this talk, I believe, is because of my long association with Professor Vern Redekop, who is the nephew of Wally Redekop, with whom I have had the pleasure of working, and with our team of Steve Moore, Merle, Richard, Mike, Sylvie, and others on the Integrative Peace Building Program. I have also been a part of Vern's class on secular spirituality. I mentored a group on secular spirituality, while the class itself was on spirituality and conflict, and we have worked together on various publications. Wally and I never actually met, but we worked for the same organization, CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency. Wally's work became really well known across the world, but especially in China. He started out his work in projects, but soon thereafter shifted into working on the interrelationships among these projects. In other words, taking a systems approach to food and agriculture. My early work, similarly, started out with projects and various organizations. I was hired just after graduation to work for the Shell Oil Company, just after my bachelor's degree, and I was involved in promoting the sales of agricultural and industrial chemicals. One of those chemicals was killing weeds in canals in Guyana, where I was born. And people asked me after a while whether I was aware of the damage that those chemicals might be doing to the ecosystem and indeed to the fish and shrimp that so many people are used in their daily diet. I was not aware. I had to admit that I was not aware, but even more importantly, I didn't seem to care. It didn't seem to bother me. After deeper reflection on this set of issues, it occurred to me that that was an extremely important part of this equation of food production and industrial development, and that local people's priorities and their livelihoods were not being taken into consideration as we promoted the goals of major corporations. Later on, I ended up building on that work, doing a master's degree and then a PhD in related fields. I ended up working on sustainable livelihoods, in which I was essentially bridging poverty and the environment. So the question then was, how do I help people get out of poverty without damaging the environment? Finally, I ended up working for CIDA for several years, and in that regard has a kind of a trajectory or a journey that is similar to Wally's. So in today's talk then, I will talk a little bit about the increasing complexity in the world, the increasing impact of human beings and the way we live our lives, the way corporations dedicate all their energies to profit making without, or I should say not always, considering the negative impact on poor people's livelihoods and the natural resource base upon which we all survive. I will then look at how we might work with complexity in peace building, in development, look at innovative solutions that are being developed, and how to scale these. I will finally make a recommendation that an integral approach, building on Ken Wilber's integral approach or meta theory, would be helpful. Perhaps the most important dimension that I think is missing and that I will bring into this equation is our own spiritual nature as human beings. So let's get underway. The graph that you are seeing shows how undernourishment has been trending over several decades. We will see that early in the 2000s, the undernourishment levels of people were quite high, and then it decreased steadily until very recently, about 4 or 5 years ago, it started to rise again. So we are having, again, this problem. The Sustainable Development Goals, which, as we all know, define the development problems of the world, both the rich and the developing world. And the recent report, the 2022 report on the Sustainable Development Goals, suggests that a lot of the progress we had made on a range of issues, on food, on poverty, on the environment, peace and security, and so on, have been reversed. The confluence of three critical crises, which are dominated by the recent COVID-19 pandemic, by the climate change issues, and by conflicts, have spin-offs impacts on a whole range of the SDGs. And so we have gone back and are now in danger of now not achieving the SDGs by 2030. So to avoid the worst effects of climate change as set out in the Paris Agreement, we will need to peak, greenhouse gases need to peak by 2025 and then go down. Unfortunately, we are on a track of steadily increasing our greenhouse gases. And indeed, it seems as though it will rise by nearly 14% by 2030. So we are not on track to keeping temperature rises below 1.5 and achieving net zero or carbon neutrality by 2050. We are indeed more on a trajectory of nearly 3.5 degrees increase in the world's temperatures compared to pre-industrial levels. Concurrently, the world is witnessing the largest number of violent conflicts since the Second World War, with 1/4 of the global population living in conflict-affected countries. Nearly 100 million people as of May 2022 have been forcibly displaced for their homes. So the combination of all of these issues creating a world that we have not seen before. How are we reacting to this? And what are we doing? One might cite the work of two of the multilateral agencies that work on development to get a sense of what they're up to. The World Bank, for example, in their report, Driving Revolutionary Ideas into Practice, their recent report, 2023, focuses on infrastructure, economic instruments such as cash transfer, economic inclusion, community-driven development programs, and then they claim to have a focus on the most vulnerable. They also are looking at digital products and services, mobile technologies, streaming and social media, and look at data, digital solutions such as artificial intelligence, which obviously can play a very important role. But I will argue in this presentation that that continues to tinker at the edges of the economic and technological changes, and the fundamental shifts that we need to get back on track and, in fact, to achieve these goals will not be achieved by that alone. It does make an important contribution, but we need to do much more. The United Nations, on the other hand, are calling for a cessation of armed conflicts, to move back to a path of diplomacy, which they consider as a precondition for sustainable development. And so they are looking to adopt approaches which are low carbon, resilient, inclusive development pathways, and thinking of a complete, comprehensive transformation of the international financial and, in fact, debt architecture. This, I would argue, is perhaps an improvement on the more technical and economic approaches. And combined, they are going to help, even significantly, but will, I think, fall short of what we need for a really fundamental transformation of the way human beings live, the way we arrange our economic affairs, the way our technologies are managed, and especially the way our corporations behave. So when I looked at the Secretary General of the United Nations call and see what is he calling for on behalf of the global community, he says we must rise higher to rescue the Sustainable Development Goals. And I will interpret rising higher, meaning to go beyond economic and technological shifts into something higher than that, through the fundamental nature, I would argue, of human beings. So in rethinking the approach to peace and development, we should, yes, continue to do what is working well, but it is time for us to adopt a bold, new, integral approach that brings together systems thinking, cultural changes, behavioral changes, and the most important missing dimension, consciousness, or our own spiritual nature in the way we make decisions, both in public policy as well as in individual lives. Now, when we look at the way our technical and economic projects and programs are designed, we find that they are typically designed in a linear, logical framework manner, which has been with us for several decades. Indeed, one might say from the time of the Second World War, just thereafter. So this is now maybe, nearly 70 years of experience. And we know where it works and where it does not. The problem is that when we use log frames for systems that are complex rather than just physical and straightforward, these frames, these log frames, these linear deterministic approaches do not work well, and we need to shift to looking at complex adaptive systems theoretical frameworks in which one can address situations, especially those which are turbulent, complex, adaptive, high degrees of uncertainty, constantly evolving. In those situations, the log frame will not work as well. Also, especially when we are working for, if you like, innovation, and which by definition one cannot know the outcome up front. So when the outcome cannot be well defined, the log frame is not going to work well, and we need to turn to complex adaptive systems thinking. In addition, however, the world is facing problems that are characterized by complexity, uncertainty, lots of interrelationships, non-linearity. That is to say, efforts are not directly proportional to results, and so on. When we have problems which have multiple causes and no clear single solution, where ambiguity seems to reign, we call those problems wicked problems. They can be tamed but cannot be solved as such. See, every wicked problem, and think of the pandemic, think of climate change, think of poverty, social exclusion, economic inequality, all of these are wicked policy problems. These problems don't tend to have precedents. We cannot draw on best practices. Those are not available in these cases. And so we need to begin to address these problems almost individually and sort of as though we are addressing unique and different problems each time, and observe by trial and error, by adaptation, by learning how to get them better. So in these complex, wicked policy problems, what's going on? How do we understand them? We have in each of these cases many actors, interconnections, relationships, and many degrees of freedom. So people can move, actors move in different directions, which are not predictable upfront. There are within these systems feedback loops. Some of these loops make problems worse. Some of these loops tend to ameliorate. If you invest in an effort that falls upon a loop that's reinforcing the problem, then your effort is going to be wasted to a large extent. If, on the other hand, you are able to identify a loop that is working to reduce that problem, a balancing loop, you will probably get a much bigger bang for your buck. Now, within these systems, we have as well self-organization occurring as well as emergence. And these phenomena can be studied and understood system by system, but they provide a lot of insight into what one might do to address these problems. So bearing in mind that these are dynamical, adaptive, coevolutionary, and uncertain kind of policy problems, it is time for us to shift from the linear deterministic approaches which we have used for a long time and which has served us well, and therefore we feel will continue to serve us for all problems to come. And that's an illusion. That's going to be a major mistake. If we take a look at this diagram, you will see what I mean. On the y-axis, we have degrees of social agreement. Do we have consensus in the society on what problem we want to solve and how to solve it? On the x-axis, we are talking about the technical solutions. How certain are we about the technical solution? So near the origin, you have high degrees of social agreement and high degrees of technical certainty. And when you are lucky to be in such a situation, the problem is simple, and therefore you don't have to worry. The traditional ways of approaching the problem will work. On the other hand, when you have not much technical certainty, but you have high degrees of social agreement, you have a technically complicated problem. Now, it's not complex, it's complicated. And by complicated, we mean that we can solve this by technical solutions. And I'll explain the difference between complicated and complex in a minute. Similarly, if you have high levels of technical certainty but not much social agreement, you are in a socially complicated zone, and there you need to build coalitions and so on. When, however, you have about an average, a certain degree of social agreement and a certain degree of technical certainty, not much or not complete lack, you're in a zone of complexity. And in that zone, you need a different set of approaches, but in that zone, you have a large number of opportunities as well. Complexity is not a constraint on the policy process or on the development process. It is only a constraint if you want to try to use traditional linear deterministic methods. But the highest sources of creativity and innovation are indeed in the complex zone, where you have the right numbers of degrees of freedom and so on. As I promised, let me quickly explain the difference between complicated and complex. The easiest way to understand this is to get two examples. If you're sending a rocket to the moon, that is complicated. But if you get it right by your adequate equations, mathematical models, solid engineering, and so on, you can write a manual, and you can begin to get it better and better. Bringing up a child, on the other hand, if you bring up one child, you cannot make a manual that will guide you to bring up the second child or the third child, because each child is unique. Each child is different, has a mind of its own, co-evolves due to its own genetic makeup, but also the way it reads its environment. That is a complex situation, constantly changing, learning, adapting, evolving. So that's the fundamental difference between complicated and complex. And although in English we use these words interchangeably, for the purposes of understanding public policy, we need to distinguish between these. Here is an example of how you might distinguish between these different situations that you will find in public policy. As you can see, where you have direct cause and effect relationships and high degrees of certainty, both socially and technically, you're in a simple zone, and you can right away sense what's going on, put it in a particular category that you are familiar with, and then you respond, and best practices work well. In the complicated zone, yes, you can sense what's going on, but now you need to do some complicated analyses, like we explained with the rocket. There is a cause and effect relationship, but many steps between cause and effect. And here, best practices don't work well. You need to be using good practices, recognizing that you constantly have to monitor the situation you're in. In the complex zone, you do not have clear cause and effect relationships. You cannot sense what's going on just by immediate observation. You need now to probe into the system, to recognize the patterns. Then you can sense what's happening and then respond. So the practices now are emergent, peculiar to every situation, and that's why, as we explained, for wicked policy problems, each needs to be treated on its own. Yes, you can learn from past experience, but not in the sense of a good or a best practice. Treat it as an individual, unique problem. A chaotic situation in which you have no consensus, either technical or social, then needs some stabilization before you can address it. I just point out that these are not categories as such for different policies. In each development project, peace project, or public policy issue, you might have an aspect that is simple, complicated, or complex. And so you need to just be monitoring and sensing that situation, making sense, one might say, of the situation. So you need these sense-making tools to recognize the situation you're in, and then you can proceed. So let's apply these ideas to peace building, for example. Peace building is a very complex situation, and if we try to go with blueprints and to impose our democratic values and systems on others, we are most likely to fail. And the history of peace building has indeed, especially complex peace building, has demonstrated that that fails. Each situation is unique. It depends on context, history, politics, local culture, and so on. So, in other words, each time we are working with a situation of violent conflict, challenges associated with violent conflict, ethnic and otherwise, it could be religious, ideological, political, we need to reinvent the wheel every time. One should recognize as well that when you are beginning to do institutional change in these circumstances, isomorphic mimicry, big word, is common, and that is that the local institutions might adopt the approach you are recommending, but you will quickly find out that it's quite superficial and they are retaining their essential traditional character, and as soon as the intervention stops, the institutions revert to whatever they were in the past. The case of Afghanistan is a classic example where the United States and allies spent billions and billions of US dollars in training the local Afghan army. And what happened when the US pulled out? The Taliban was able to take over in days. That well-trained or so-called well-trained Afghan army just collapsed in the face of the Taliban. They had not adopted the values, the principles, and the deep changes required to sustain. So in the integrative peace building work that Vern and the team and myself were involved in developing for complex peace building situations, we developed this program we called integrative peace building, and it has three theoretical pillars. One is complexity theory, which I've explained already, mimetic theory after René Girard, in which René Girard points out that people tend to desire what others desire, and the failure to get that they desire leads to conflict. Vern and others have looked at this in terms of using mimetic desire for peace building. And the final approach that brings it together that we have brought into this integrative peace building work is integral theory, the integral meta theory of Ken Wilber, that helps us to bring consciousness studies, behavioral studies, cultural and systems work in the 4-quadrant that Wilber talks about together. And with these principles, we then developed an approach that is integrative in nature to try and cross the silos that one finds in peace building. Here is an example which is a subset of a systems analysis of the Syrian conflict that we have had for a very long time, which has subsided, but as we know, not necessarily with the kinds of democratic outcomes we would have wanted, or most of the world, that is. Some stakeholders, of course, would appreciate the outcome as it is. In this systems analysis, you will see most of the loops labeled R are reinforcing the conflict. There is only one loop that tends to balance it. So if you are intervening in a conflict like this, you will want to build on the balancing loop, working and sometimes inadvertently in areas in which there are these reinforcing loops would diminish the impact of your work. Let's turn to making policy in the face of complexity. Now, public policy requires some degree of predictability, but complexity implies inherent uncertainty. So how do you do this? How do you cope? And here you have to create adaptive policies through integrative and forward-looking analysis, bringing together multi-stakeholders for deliberation, decentralizing governance, enabling self-organization, enabling social networking capacity of communities, and most importantly, constantly reviewing, learning, and building in the flexibility to change course because things are not going to work according to expectations. There are a range of tools that can help us to make policy in the face of complexity. Emery Rowe has written on this, and he talks about using the workhorse of public policy analysis, which is cost-benefit analysis, and then bringing in narrative policy making as well as local justice systems. We now have a range of other tools such as design thinking, strategic foresight, scenario building, and so on, which are all helpful in making policy in the face of complexity. In this slide, I summarize a wide range of techniques, including some newer techniques which can help us to make public policy in the face of complexity. Some examples of the use of these tools, now they are becoming more and more popular and common. In Japan, they are using them in disaster management, in the European Union, in predicting zones of unrest and potential conflict. In the US, they are used in tracking terrorist cells and terrorist networks. In Germany, in modeling greenhouse gases and growing the economy at the same time. In health, an example is in London, in the United Kingdom, fighting tuberculosis, education policy, and so on. One recognizes that this is becoming more and more mainstream when the OECD, the Club of Developed Countries, begins publishing on complexity and public policy. And indeed, there are 3 papers, 3 monographs on this. When you want to design programs or projects, one can build on emergent creativity and the energy of a system. That approach has been called gentle action by David Peat in his book of the same name. I have been using this approach for a long time in my own work in international development, especially with sustainable livelihoods without having called it gentle action, because that's a phrase I learned only about a decade ago. So what difference does it make? How do you approach a development situation using gentle action or emergent creativity? Well, let's take poverty as an example. In my approach to working with the poor in poor communities, the first fundamental shift is to start with what they have, not with what they need. So you start with the assets of the poor. You start with their knowledge, their adaptive energies, and so you are able to tap into their creativity, to their energy. And then you use the next steps I can summarize quickly. In fact, the next steps are simply you work with people, you do an asset mapping, and that means looking at human capital, social capital, natural capital, physical capital, and financial capital. Now, poor people don't have much physical or economic or financial capital, but they do always have human, social, and natural capital. And you have a base that you can work on. The next step in working with this is to get them to articulate a vision of a better life. What would they consider to be sustainable livelihoods? Having done that, you then get them to articulate what is it that they can do on their own to improve their lives. Only then you discuss what help do they need from outside. And that might be money, technology, policy, governance, support, and so on. You see, in this approach, you are now tapping in to the emergent creativity of the local people. And that makes a world of difference compared to the situation in which you go in and you look at their needs. Immediately you begin to set up a dependency syndrome. The situation is, I have or we have, you do not have, we will give to you. Very different set of dynamics. We have applied this approach in many, many countries around the world. A very recent one is in the case of Yemen, in which we were able, the international community that is, were able to work in several pockets in which there was peace in Yemen and to help the people to rebuild their livelihoods. Examples of what elements were supported was like cash for work to rehabilitate. All the wells and community centers and health centers are damaged during this war. Their little businesses have been damaged. And at the local level, we worked with the local people to move them forward. One of the big deals was energy. Most of the power plants have been destroyed. So how do you begin then to get people to get energy again? And one of the big problems, of course, in Yemen is very hot. The sun is blazing all the time. Now that sunshine is an asset if you use solar energy. And that's exactly what was done by this project called Enhancing Rural Resilience in Yemen, supported by the European Union and currently supported again by the European Union in the second phase and by the Swedish government. Now, one of the big deals or problems with working in these complex situations, whether they be in peace building, in policy, or in project development, is how do you scale small, successful, innovative projects and make them scale to the level required in the time. So speed and scale are critical. We have quite a bit of experience in scaling out. These are efforts to replicate and disseminate innovative programs, products, and ideas to affect a larger group of people or to cover a wide geographical area. We have learned a little bit about scaling deep, which is about transforming the quality of social relations through changes in people's hearts, in their minds, their values, and their cultural approaches. We are recognizing now, more and more in this work, that human agency can transcend scales to connect individuals through collective and systemic change. One of the recent developments that I want to really highlight is the use of fractal approaches to scaling transformations, which was described in a recent paper by Karen O'Brien, drawing on the work of Monica Sharma and others. You see, fractals are self-similar patterns that repeat across many scales, such that small parts of an object look similar to the whole. Mathematical models have produced infinite similar fractals, but finite fractal-like patterns are common in nature, in beehives, leaves, river systems, and so on. But in social systems, we haven't looked at fractals in the past. These can be described as self-similar patterns that repeat themselves across a range of social structures, such as interactions from community scale organizations through districts, national level, through to the global and international. And this opens up an opportunity for us to begin to scale values, which is the critical one that has been missing. Here is an example of a fractal. You can see very similar patterns repeating over and over from a small scale to a large scale. This is a leaf vein in which this repeats itself starting from a very small local area right onto entire trees and forests. This is a mathematical fractal, the Mandelbrot set, in which one can generate and test these ideas. So this is really an exciting opportunity then for us to begin to think of using the fractal approaches not to scale things, innovations and so on alone, but also to begin to scale universal values that are required for the transformation of the world into a more sustainable path. So it goes beyond scaling technologies, behaviors, and projects to now scaling universal values such as oneness, integrity, spiritual understanding, and so on. So really exciting and hopeful. Here is how you do it. 3 spheres. The 3 spheres are where personal action, political action, and practical action are working hand in hand on different fractal levels. The powers of 10 of fractal scaling is amazing. If you're alone, you're 10 to the 0, that is 1, you just cannot achieve much on your own. As soon as you begin to recognize similar patterns and work in developing them in the family, in the society and the community, you begin to scale by powers of 10 and can go on to billions and trillions. Now we need to bring it all together, and integral approaches will help us to do that. We need to recognize that there is a growing interest in interior and subjective dimensions of transformative change. That is to say, people are recognizing their own spiritual nature more and more, not necessarily religious. In fact, the data shows that more and more people are moving away from religion, but becoming more and more spiritual at the same time. What is that? That is a recognition of your own true nature. It's not about following a set of beliefs, a set of creeds, or a set of teachings from a particular doctrine. But personal transformations alone are seldom sufficient to transform the inequitable and unsustainable systems and structures that are maintained by power, politics, privilege, and vested interest. We need to remember that that's a huge problem and bring these to work together. And that is why I find the Ken Wilber approach or the Ken Wilber meta theory very helpful. As you can see in this slide, we look at individuals and groups, collectives, society, and internal and external factors. The individual internal is about the consciousness of an individual. The individual external is their behavioral patterns. Collective or social internal is about culture. And then in the collective external is where we always worked, with systems. Now we are already doing well on public policy in behavioral change with behavioral economics, behavioral science, psychology has developed well and beginning to be linked to public policy. Collective interior culture anthropology, ethnography, and so on are developing well and beginning to be linked to public policy. The systems work has been going on for a very long time. The one missing dimension that we now need to bring, and we have started research on this at my own center in India, at the Center for the Study of Complexity Economics, Applied Spirituality and Public Policy at the O.P. Jindal Global University in Haryana. We are doing work now that links the missing dimension of human spirituality and of consciousness, and bringing this together with appropriate methodological systems is the research underway that we hope can really help to correct that. You see, the core problem for public policy, we believe, is firstly to recognize the separation where humans feel separated from nature and separated from each other. That's a false separation. We, in fact, share a common consciousness. We are one with nature, but over time, due to various historical factors such as the Newtonian scientific revolution, the Industrial Revolution, while they produced a lot of material goods, we lost our true nature along the way, or the recognition. So we have ended up with a civilization that is fossil fuel-driven capitalism. The dominant civilizational ethic is that progress and success are merely or mainly based on material accumulation. This narrative, at its core, has to be changed. Yes, we do have maybe 1 billion people who need to get more and more material wealth in order to get out of poverty. But large numbers are also not requiring more and more. In fact, more and more wealth is not necessarily leading to a higher quality of life. So the challenge for this kind of work then is that most of these programs by default assume that we have this separation as the reality from which we proceed. So we end up asking the wrong questions of how to correct the symptoms like overconsumption, pollution, species extinction, and so on, and expect that we will solve the cause of the problem. So yes, that will help with the symptoms, and we need to address the symptoms because they are severe. But we cannot expect that we will cure the cancer by curing the symptom. And that is why we need to go to this deeper dimension that I've just mentioned. So understanding our true nature, I think there's a lot now in all of the world's major religions. In the core mystical nature of Christianity, the work of Father Thomas Keating, Father Thomas Morton, the Desert Fathers, John of the Cross, and so on, lead us to the mystical core. The same is true of Buddhism, Taoism, the Sufism, dimensions of Islam. They all lead us to understanding our true nature. In Sanskrit, in Advaita Vedanta, the question is, you start by the process, who am I? And finally, you figure out that you come to nothing, finally to consciousness or everything. So the point then is, what does this mean for public policy? And then we will wrap this up. So the public policy implications of understanding consciousness or your own true nature. And by the way, these are supported, this deeper understanding of oneself is supported by the modern sciences of quantum-like thinking, quantum physics, complexity science and complexity theory, as well as the most recent neuroscience research, which is now pretty convincing that matter is not the primary stuff of the universe, but rather consciousness is. And I leave you to do the research to see what is there behind. I will provide some references so that you can read that up and look at the evidence. Very compelling. So the policy implications. First, we have to shift the default purpose of public policy, which is almost always increases in GDP per capita, and ask questions such as, what would public policy look like if the objective was greater love, harmony, inner development, compassion in our societies? we need to shift ethical public policy. What are the ethics that need to be shifted from utilitarian and deontological or duty ethics, rules-based ethics, to ontological ethics, the ethics of being, or policies to support life systems. Political economy must shift as well from who gets what how to the politics of being, i.e., we need to shift from what we are. Currently, we are not really human beings. I mean, think about it. We spend our lives as human havings, having this, having that, having more and more, never thinking of being. Also, leadership must shift, and our leaders will now need to adopt more spiritual, authentic, servant-type leadership principles, which we know a lot about and is well established in the literature. Institutional shifts as well need to really begin to be redesigned on the basis that we don't have to always be confronting each other and looking at who gets what more than the other one, i.e., power as a zero-sum game. Our institutional design must be based on power as a positive-sum game. That is to say, you do not have to lose for me to win. That kind of design will make a major shift. Those are some of the public policy, institutional, and leadership shifts that I believe have now become necessary. We can now also move from material capital and measuring merely IQ. You remember measuring IQs, which were rational, how we think, and then we learned about social capital, or measuring emotional quotient, emotional intelligence, how we feel and how we relate to society. Now we are able to measure spiritual capital, spiritual intelligence. And one can put it in this frame, although that this does have some instrumental value in instrumentality. But now we are asking the question, what I am, or what am I? So it is time, from what I think and what I feel, for us to begin to ask the fundamental question of what am I, or who am I, and beginning to bring that understanding into public policy. See, Einstein had put it really beautifully in which he said, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. And both are important. The problem is we have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. That is about the best way to summarize what I've just been sharing with you. As I mentioned before, most recent new scientific insights all support the work of the world's major wisdom traditions I have just mentioned. Cognitive neuroscience, coming from Donald Hoffman from the University of California, Ian McGilchrist in 2 recent books, the Master and his Emissary, as well as the Matter with Things, they all show that what we are now sort of understanding is really closer to the truth than ever before. And so we need to develop strategies to move forward. I recommend working the research agenda should be to build more on the integral public policy, and we need to begin to teach and support evolutionary change in a very different way, building on Ken Wilber's integral quadrants. The long-term strategy is training a new batch of social, economic, political scientists, academics, teachers, leaders, and so on. But we might not have enough time. And so the integral public policy approach, I hope, can help to hasten and accelerate that shift. Leadership can shift by bringing together spiritual intelligence with what we have always used, rational intelligence or IQ, with emotional intelligence and EQ. Training leaders based upon these criteria will help us to move this whole revolution forward. In conclusion, let me just quote from two people. Emerson, and he says, "What lies behind you and what lies in front of you pale in comparison to what lies inside of you." And the well-known quote from Robert Frost, "Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." I urge you to adopt these approaches as we go forward, as we work together towards this new vision of humanity. Thank you.